Who are the Oath Keepers? I am very proud to introduce the leader to you, Army veteran and Yale University law grad, Stuart Rhodes, who founded Oath Keepers. They have drawn a line in the sand and declared, "Don't cross that line." That line begins at the Constitution of the United States. Many Americans have sworn an oath to uphold the United States Constitution, and some of them meant it. They still mean it. Those who belong to Oath Keepers have courageously reaffirmed that they will not obey unconstitutional and immoral orders because those orders are illegal under the Constitution. Oath Keepers intend to protect and defend free speech as it appears in the First Amendment of the Constitution, no matter what the message is, because we all have a right to speak out without being arrested. We have a right to protest the actions of government, and we better do it now before we lose the last of our rights. Do you want to see the Federal Reserve, a private cartel of banksters, passing out your money, creating inflation, and driving prices so high that you can't afford to buy food? When do you think you will be able to act? After QE9, QE10? Quantitative easing is a euphemism for counterfeiting. Oath Keepers are heroically planning to occupy the Federal Reserve, also known as the Fed. Oath Keepers feel that the Fed is the source of the problem. Without the Federal Reserve, the Wall Street criminals would be set back 100 years, Oath Keepers say. I say, I am proud of Americans who call themselves Oath Keepers. Shame on those who do not support the sacred national document which made our country great in the first place. Now I want to read you something from oath-keepers.blogspot.com. The time is now near at hand which must probably determine whether Americans are to be freemen or slaves, whether they are to have any property they can call their own, whether their houses and farms are to be pillaged and destroyed, and they consigned to a state of wretchedness from which no human efforts will probably deliver them. The fate of unborn millions will now depend under God on the courage and conduct of this army. That was said by General George Washington to his troops before the Battle of Long Island. Such a time is near at hand again. The fate of unborn millions will now depend under God on the courage and the conduct of this Army and this Marine Corps, this Air Force, this Navy, and the National Guard units of these sovereign states. Oath Keepers is a nonpartisan association of currently serving military, reserves, National Guard, peace officers, and veterans who swore on oath to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and meant it. Our oath is to the Constitution, not the politicians, and that oath will be kept. We won't just follow orders. Below is our declaration of orders we will not obey, because we consider them unconstitutional and thus unlawful, and immoral violations of the natural rights of the people. Such orders will be acts of war against the American people by their own government, and thus acts of treason. We will not make war against our own people. We will not commit treason. We will defend the Republic. Declaration of orders we will not obey. Recognizing that we each swore an oath to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and affirming that we are guardians of the Republic, of the principles of our Declaration of Independence, and of the rights of the people, we affirm and declare the following. 1. We will not obey any order to disarm the American people. The attempt to disarm the people on April 19, 1775, was the spark of open conflict in the American Revolution. That vile attempt was an act of war, and the American people fought back in justified, righteous self-defense of their natural rights. Any such order today would also be an act of war against the American people, and thus an act of treason. We will not make war on our own people, and we will not commit treason by obeying any such treasonous order. Nor will we assist or support any such attempt to disarm the people by other government entities, either state or federal. In addition, we affirm that the purpose of the Second Amendment is to preserve the military power of the people so that they will, in their last resort, have an effective final recourse to arms and to the God of hosts in the face of tyranny. Accordingly, we oppose any and all further infringements on the rights of the people to keep and bear arms. In particular, we oppose a renewal of the misnamed assault weapons ban or enactment of H.R. 45, which would register and track gun owners like convicted pedophiles. 2. We will not obey any order to conduct warrantless searches of the American people, their homes, vehicles, papers, or effects, such as warrantless house-to-house searches for weapons or persons. One of the causes of the American Revolution was the use of writs of assistance, which were essentially warrantless searches because there was no requirement of a showing of probable cause to a judge, and the first fiery embers of American resistance were born in opposition to those infamous writs. The founders considered all warrantless searches to be unreasonable and egregious. It was to prevent a repeat of such violations of the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects that the Fourth Amendment was written. We expect that sweeping warrantless searches of homes and vehicles under some pretext will be the means used to attempt to disarm the people. We will not obey any order to detain American citizens as unlawful enemy combatants or to subject them to trial by military tribunal. One of the causes of the American Revolution was the denial of the right to jury trial, the use of admiralty courts or military tribunals instead, and the application of the laws of war to the colonists. After that experience and being well aware of the infamous Star Chamber in English history, the founders ensured that the international laws of war would apply only to foreign enemies, not to the American people. Thus, Article 3, Treason Clause, establishes the only constitutional forum of trial for an American not serving in the military who is accused of making war on his own nation. Such a trial for treason must be before a civilian jury, not a tribunal. The international laws of war do not trump our Bill of Rights. We reject as illegitimate any such claimed power, as did the Supreme Court in Ex parte Milligan 1865. Any attempt to apply the laws of war to American civilians under any pretext, such as against domestic militia groups the government brands domestic terrorists, is an act of war and an act of treason. Number 4. We will not obey orders to impose martial law or a state of emergency on a state, or to enter with force into a state without express consent and invitation of that state's legislature and governor. One of the causes of the American Revolution was the attempt to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power, by disbanding the Massachusetts legislature and appointing General Gage as military governor. The attempt to disarm the people of Massachusetts during that martial law sparked our revolution. Accordingly, the power to impose martial law, the absolute rule over the people by a military officer, with his will alone being law, is nowhere enumerated in our Constitution. Further, it is the militia of a state and of several states that the Constitution contemplates being used in any context during an emergency within a state, not the standing army. The imposition of martial law by the national government over a state and its people, treating them as an occupied enemy nation, is an act of war. Such an attempted suspension of the Constitution and Bill of Rights voids the compact with the states and with the people. Number 5. We will not obey orders to invade and subjugate any state that asserts its sovereignty and declares the national government to be in violation of the compact by which that state entered the Union. In response to the obscene growth of federal power and to the absurdly totalitarian claimed powers of the executive, upwards of 20 states are considering, have considered, or have passed courageous resolutions affirming states' rights and sovereignty. Those resolutions followed in the honored and revered footsteps of Jefferson and Madison in their Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, and likewise seek to enforce the Constitution by affirming the very same principles of our Declaration, Constitution, and Bill of Rights that we Oath Keepers recognize and affirm. Chief among those principles is that ours is a dual sovereignty system, with the people of each state retaining all powers not granted to the national government they created, and thus the people of each state reserve to themselves the right to judge when the national government they created has voided the compact between the states by asserting powers never granted. Upon the declaration by a state that such a breach has occurred, we will not obey orders to force that state to submit to the national government. Number 6, we will not obey any order to blockade American cities, thus turning them into giant concentration camps. One of the causes of the American Revolution was the blockade of Boston and the occupying of that city by the British military under martial law. Once hostilities began, the people of Boston were tricked into turning in their arms in exchange for safe passage, but were then forbidden to leave. That confinement of the residents of an entire city was an act of war. Such tactics were repeated by the Nazis in the Warsaw Ghetto and by the Imperial Japanese in Nanking, turning entire cities into death camps. Any such order to disarm and confine the people of an American city will be an act of war, and thus an act of treason. Number 7, we will not obey any order to force American citizens into any form of detention camps under any pretext. Mass forced internment into concentration camps was a hallmark of every fascist and communist dictator in the 20th century. Such an internment was unfortunately even used against American citizens of Japanese descent during World War II. Whenever a government interns its own people, it treats them like an occupied enemy population. Oppressive governments often use the internment of women and children to break the will of the men fighting for their liberty, as was done to the Boers, to the Jewish resistors in the Warsaw Ghetto, and to the Chechens, for example. Such a vile order to forcibly intern Americans without charges or trial would be an act of war against the American people, and thus an act of treason. Regardless of the pretext used, we will not commit treason, nor will we facilitate or support it, not on our watch. Number 8, we will not obey orders to assist or support the use of any foreign troops on U.S. soil against the American people to keep the peace or maintain control during an emergency or under any other pretext. We will consider such use of foreign troops against our own people to be an invasion and an act of war. During the American Revolution, the British government enlisted the aid of Hessian mercenaries in an attempt to subjugate the rebellious American people. Throughout history, repressive regimes have enlisted the aid of foreign troops and mercenaries who have no bonds with the people. Accordingly, as the militia of several states are the only military force contemplated by the Constitution in Article 1, Section 8 for domestic keeping of the peace, and as the use of even our own standing army for such purposes is without such constitutional support, the use of foreign troops and mercenaries against the people is wildly unconstitutional, egregious, and an act of war. We will oppose such troops as enemies of the people, and we will treat all who request, invite, and aid those foreign troops as the traitors they are. Number 9, we will not obey any orders to confiscate the property of the American people, including food and other essential supplies, under any emergency pretext whatsoever. One of the causes of the American Revolution was the seizure and forfeiture of American ships, goods, and supplies, along with the seizure of American timber for the Royal Navy, all in violation of the people's natural right to their property and to the fruits of their labor. The final spark of the revolution was the attempt by the government to seize powder and cannon stores at Concord. Deprivation of food has long been a weapon of war and oppression, with millions intentionally starved to death by fascist and communist governments in the 20th century alone. Accordingly, we will not obey or facilitate orders to confiscate food and other essential supplies from the people, and we consider all those who carry out such orders to be enemies of the people. Number 10, we will not obey any orders which infringe on the right of the people to free speech, to peaceably assemble, and to petition their government for a redress of grievances. There would have been no American Revolution without fiery speakers and writers such as James Otis, Patrick Henry, Thomas Paine, and Sam Adams, setting brush fires of freedom in the minds of men. Patrick Henry, "Give me liberty or give me death." Tyrants know that the pen of a man such as Thomas Paine can cause them more damage than entire armies, and thus they always seek to suppress the natural rights of speech, association, and assembly. Without freedom of speech, the people will have no recourse but to arms. Without freedom of speech and conscience, there is no freedom. Therefore, we will not obey or support any orders to suppress or violate the rights of the people to speak, associate, worship, assemble, communicate, or petition government for their redress of grievances. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually affirm our oath and pledge to each other our lives our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Oath Keepers.